Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. So first, a couple of things about norbloc. So about the company, who we are. Essentially, we have two types of people in norbloc. The one group comes from finance and consulting, and then we have the other group that basically comes very much from the Bitcoin mining world and blockchain development world. So essentially, what we did is that we came together and we tried to find what is actually one of the most pressing problems that we can solve today in the finance world that also can be solved using blockchain technology and not just use blockchain as a marketing word. So what we did is that we started and we had many workshops with banks, and we asked them, we explained first of all what blockchain technology is, if you can do this within an hour or half. And then we asked them, what are the problems that you're facing? And where do you see this technology actually becoming relevant to solving these problems? So when we went in, we're thinking we're going to do exotic derivatives, payment settlements, some amazingly interesting things. But actually what happened is that we heard about Know Your Customer. So Know Your Customer is actually an integral part of finance. It's actually a core regulatory aspect of banks that basically what they have to do is that they have to, when someone goes to start a relationship or has an ongoing relationship, they have to know who that person or the corporation is. Now, that seems very simple. I mean, what you can do is that you ask a couple of questions and then here it goes. It's not that difficult. But actually, it's much more complex. When we're looking at corporations, it can take up to 2 months for a corporation to onboard with a bank. And it should not be like this. Now, then we said, okay, that's fine. That seems to be a problem. But how big of a problem is it? And in finance, everything is measured in money. So even how big a problem is, again, is how expensive it is. And it's actually very expensive. We did the bottom-up analysis for one of the top 4 Swedish banks, and it came to around $60 million spent every year on KYC. And this is not because they actually invest in rocket science to solve KYC. This is because they actually take up a lot of time of people, especially in the front line, going after customers to find out information about them and information about their companies. And actually, this is about to become even trickier. Because we have new regulations coming into play in July. We have new regulations coming into play in the beginning of next year and actually in May next year. So the next 12 months is going to be a regulatory nightmare for banks and a regulatory treasure hunt for the regulators. Now, what we did is that, okay, we have the problem here. It seems to be a very pressing problem. What we did afterwards is that we said we're going to interview as many people as we can. And we interviewed many people in banks. I mean, this is the obvious place to go, both in the front line, but also in the compliance departments. Then we actually talked to the regulators to see their view and how they actually go after banks and how they review banks and audit banks around KYC. And very importantly, we talked to the customers. And this is where actually the biggest complaints emerged. So if you talk to a corporate treasurer, probably the most painful thing he's going to do in his annual, let's say, in his yearly report is actually doing KYC, renewing KYC with the banks that the corporation is using. Now, this is all fine, and this, to a certain extent, we knew about this. We just found out more details. But then, if you scratch the surface, you realize that there's so many other companies that have to perform KYC on their customers. And these companies are actually many companies involved in the fintech world. So if you take iZettle, Trustly, Klarna, Qliro, all these are companies that have to perform KYC again. And if you think it's painful for a bank to do this, then think about a fast-moving organization that has to move extremely quickly and focus on commercial aspect rather than the regulatory aspect. So overall, very painful process, many people asking for change. But how do you bring blockchain into the whole equation? Why is blockchain very relevant? So basically, if you look at the key problems of why KYC doesn't work right now, first thing is actually duplication of efforts. There's duplication of efforts for various reasons. For example, if you take a corporation has on average around 3 business banking relationships. What that means is that they have to do KYC for each one of these relationships. And it's the exact same things that banks are asking for. They have to do it also on an annual basis, according to the law. So it becomes an amazing effort from the corporation towards these 3 banks. But guess what? You have each bank doing the exact same thing, checking the same documents, verifying the same documents, and basically just doing the whole work over and over again. Limited digitization. I am Greek. I'm used to limited digitization. When I came to Sweden quite a while back, I was hoping that it would be an amazingly effortless and seamless transition into something purely digital, to onboard a bank, to basically ask the bank to give you information. It's actually still very much a paper process. You get papers on the mail, you have to fill them in and then take them to the branch. If you don't answer the first time, they send them again. You don't answer again, they call you and they say, well, your account will be closed unless you write down all these things that we request you to write. So very limited digitization even nowadays. Third thing, spotty audit trail. It's very important when someone does an audit of what happened when, so for example, the regulator goes to a bank and says, let's see if you know your customers. Let's take that branch, that guy, John Smith, what do you know about him? Then someone has to find what has happened, when we asked John Smith about all the information. And that's a completely spotty audit trail at best. There have been many cases where actually the regulator went to some of the banks that are major banks in Scandinavia, and they found out there is actually zero KYC file, not a spotty KYC file. So how do we actually create a platform which is blockchain can actually alleviate quite a few of these problems? Well, actually blockchain can alleviate quite a few things because, first of all, it's a very secure and it's an immutable way of recording information. So that's a very, very important element when you're thinking about audit trail of what has happened. The other important element about blockchain is actually it can hold reference to something. If you hold reference to something, that means that I can take that something and carry it around parties and share it between different parties. And every single time I perform a change on that element, then all the parties that hold that reference know about it. So essentially, it can be the pinnacle, the core of a solution to the KYC problem, to many of the KYC problems that we're actually facing. So what we did with norbloc is we said, we're not going to do POCs, we're not going to do consulting work around blockchain, let's focus on that one thing. KYC, let's make a production-ready platform. And actually, we launched it last month, and now we have 5 top-tier European banks actually testing the platform. The way it works is very simple. You go to a bank, you give your email, you prove your ID and your corporate identification number. You get an email from the bank saying that I would like your information, you fill it in, send it back to the bank approves it, then they do extra work that actually it's internal to the bank, and then you have a KYC file which has been placed in that blockchain by the bank that you can actually carry between banks. You can use with suppliers, you can use with whoever you want. Now, why this is actually relevant? Let's give an example going back to fintechs. Let's say that I want to get an iZettle little machine. iZettle has to do a KYC on me as a merchant. Now, it's very likely I have a banking relationship with someone in Sweden, let's say. That means that iZettle can say, hey, SEB, you actually have an account of that guy, so that means you've done the KYC. Can I get the KYC file from him? And this platform actually allows this to be done. And because everything is interconnected, SEB can also ask for a payment from iZettle for actually doing the verification in the first place, because actually they expended time doing so. Now, this is essentially the platform, how it works. This is actually how you can send the KYC request. It's online, and we've actually started issuing the test accounts, and people can go and test it themselves. The beauty around this is actually not what you see here. I mean, the interface is quite beautiful, I would like to think so as well, but actually it's very much what's behind it. And what's behind it is actually a quite advanced architecture. It's a quite advanced architecture for various reasons, because the first thing that actually we thought, and it's actually what, when you hear blockchain KYC, is like, okay, great, I'm going to take that file, put it on a blockchain, permissioned or not, then people will just share it and it's going to be great. And this is actually something that doesn't necessarily work. So the first thing is actually nothing touches the blockchain until the officer presses verify. So the moment someone verifies, a bank officer, a piece of information, this is recorded on the blockchain. No one else can write actually on that blockchain. That actually creates a very, very good input from the physical, if you can call it, or real world on the blockchain. One thing we forget is that the interface between the two is crucial, because the information, unless they're vetted when they go in, then you cannot, of course, once they're in, you don't change them, but if something that is in is actually flawed, then it doesn't really matter at all. Now, What happened is that we said in the beginning, let's put everything on the blockchain. We're super happy. We said, okay, great, we solved the problem within 1 month. Everything is ready. And then what we did is that, well, part of actually launching a production-ready platform is talking to lawyers, because, you know, we may like them or not. They may be expensive, or actually they are expensive. It's just, there's not a not in this case. But you actually have to get clearance, especially when we talk to compliance departments. We cannot just show up and say, okay, that's great, we're ready, let's go. So what they said is that there's a couple of, let's say, legislation and regulations that you have to adhere to. So you have the 4th AML directive by the EU. You have GDPR, which, by the way, talking about blockchain and personal data, GDPR is probably the single regulation that's going to make it extremely challenging for recording personal data on a blockchain. And also, what else you have the bank secrecy law, which is a Sweden-specific law, but also you have then different other legislations around the EU. So they looked into our platform and they said, well, you know, it's great, but you cannot put the actual file on the blockchain. Why? Because actually, even let's say you have 2 banks, and I've onboarded with 1 bank. That means that one of the banks has my full KYC file, and they can see my KYC file. The other bank, I'm not a customer. They should not know anything about me. At the same time, if they are a node in the blockchain, they hold a full copy, encoded, but full copy of my file. Now, the law is extremely ambiguous when it comes to encoded data and plain data. And then, in the beginning, we thought for a couple of days, should we take the legal battle and, you know, be the crusaders against, you know, defining what is encoded and what is plain data, etc. We said, actually, let's skip that. And let's go with an architecture that is very likely to be much more secure and much more compliant. So essentially what happens is that we have a couple of things. We have the customer interface. So basically this is what the customer, it's a UI that, you know, you can use any browser, your smartphone, etc., to onboard. You have the bank interface and server, which basically is what the bank officer sees, but also the server that holds any intermediate data in the entire process of a KYC onboarding. And then what we've done is that we have a permission blockchain that right now we've built on Hyperledger Fabric and a mirroring proprietary design database. The proprietary design database is the one that holds the actual KYC file. And the way it works is that if you own the customer relationship, you have the full KYC file. If you don't own the relationship, then you only have pieces of the file that you cannot use separately. They're completely useless. So essentially, this is how we built the system. And right now we're testing with quite a few banks. It's actually one thing to note is that let's say, the pool that we have from banks is very different. So some of them, they say that we want to solve the problem, we want to make it easier for the customer. Others are saying, I want to lower costs dramatically. Others are saying, I'm the most amazing bank in doing KYC, and I want to sell it to others. Can you help me do that? Monetize on something that I'm spending already tons of money on. So essentially, all these different elements, all these different needs, we can actually cover with a solution that we've built. I actually managed to do it in record time, I think. I practiced a lot. So I'm happy, you know, to open for questions if there are any. Very good question. So essentially, the nodes, the processing nodes for the blockchain and the database resides at banks. Each one of the banks in the platform, they have 4 or 5 nodes that they run, and basically this is where the data sits. And there are we have basically created 2 database designs. One is bank internal, and the other one is intra-bank, so essentially how the database communicate between the banks. Very good question. Yeah, actually, yes, absolutely. Because what happens is that our platform is not a standalone platform. For example, in Sweden, we fully have implemented an API with Bank ID, so you can authenticate yourself and you can sign documents. So in countries where we have an EID, it's perfect. It solves so many of the problems. We also have functionality in case we don't have EID that, you know, you attach your passport picture, but then you have to either video conference when you can or actually go to the branch. But in many cases, you don't want to do this. So yes, it absolutely works great with an EID together. Why did you select Hyperledger instead of, for example, Ethereum or something? Yeah, very good question. So actually, we started with Ethereum. This is that was when we first started writing the code. But then what happened is that we actually saw quite a few positive elements around Fabric, using Fabric. And quite a few of them have to do very much with personal data and how it's handled. And also how you can actually make transactions, the validating nodes actually being in a subset of the consenting nodes that you have in the network. So these are the two things that actually, having said that, it's not that we're locked into Hyperledger Fabric. Obviously, we're following now what's going on with Quora, etc., and with the Ethereum Alliance. So if something comes in a permission environment that we think that it would be better, then obviously, we're more than happy to move there. Please.
The EU regulatory, is it primarily for banks, or is it in general for companies that say you have a company and you want to sell products through the blockchain?
So actually, the EU part, it has to do with KYC, and it touches not only on banks, but on any obliged entity, as they call it. So basically, these are from leasing companies to accounting companies, etc., anyone that has to do KYC. So it purely focuses on KYC. The GDPR part, which is extremely important, and by the way, this is something that I'm not sure people understand the importance of it. GDPR essentially is the law around personal data. It comes into effect next year in May. The fines, if you don't adhere to that law, are set to 2 or 4% of your global revenues. So it's not going to be 10 million kroner or 20 million kroner that basically we see these fines flying around and people are like, oh, okay, great, it's fine. It's 2 or 4% of the revenue. So basically, GDPR is for personal data, and the fourth AML KYC directive is purely for KYC, how you do KYC and who has to do KYC.
I think that's all we have time for.